My name is Angelina, and I am 28 years old. I've been sitting on this story for about 2 weeks now, and I won't pretend I don't still feel a small, guilty spark of satisfaction every time I think about how it unfolded. I'm not proud of that feeling, but it exists, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What happened didn't start with yelling or betrayal or some dramatic explosion. It started with assumptions, quiet ones, the kind people make when they're comfortable, when they think they understand the rules of a life they never actually bothered to read the fine print on. I had been with my fiancé for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, and living together for just over a year. On the surface, we looked solid, the kind of couple people assumed would make it. We rented a 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place you imagine hosting backyard barbecues and future birthdays. A decent yard, enough space to breathe. He loved to call it our house, loved telling people how proud he was of what we'd built together. Here's the part he never questioned. The house was never his. My best friend since middle school, the kind of friend who knows every version of you, had a dad who owned several rental properties. When my fiancé and I started talking about moving in together, she connected us. Her dad trusted me. He'd known me since I was 12, knew my character, knew I paid my bills. He offered us a deal that was almost too good to be true. The lease, however, was in my name only, not as a power move, not as a secret, just practicality. I handled the paperwork. I paid the first month's rent and the security deposit out of my savings, $4,200. After that, my fiancé and I split rent evenly, but legally, on paper, I was the sole tenant. He never asked to see the lease, never asked questions. "You handle the boring stuff," he'd say. "I'm bad with paperwork." At the time, I thought it was harmless. Endearing, even. Love has a way of making red flags look like personality quirks when you're not ready to see them for what they are. Then there was his mother. She had been a constant presence in our relationship from the beginning. Weekly dinners at her place were non-negotiable. Sunday phone calls that somehow always stretched past 2 hours. She had opinions about everything, delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. My cooking, my career, the way I loaded the dishwasher, the length of my hair, how often I worked late. She framed every critique as concern, every boundary violation as love, and my fiancé, every single time, defended her, or minimized it, or told me she meant well. I tolerated it. I smiled through clenched teeth. I told myself she'd be my mother-in-law someday, and peace was worth the effort. I adjusted. I compromised. I swallowed irritation so often it started to feel normal. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. My fiancé came home from visiting his mom with an energy I didn't recognize. I was in the kitchen making dinner when he sat at the counter and just watched me. Silent. Intense. 5 full minutes passed before I asked if everything was okay. He said the words that always signal trouble. "We need to talk." He explained that his mom's landlord had sold her building. New owners. Renovations. No lease renewals. She had 60 days to find somewhere else to live. I felt genuinely bad for her. Housing is stressful, especially at her age. I asked if she was looking at places nearby, if there was anything we could do to help. He paused. I told her she could move in here. I stopped stirring the pan, asked him to repeat himself because surely I'd misunderstood. He clarified, casually, that it would be temporary, just until she figured something out. When I asked how long that might be, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He talked about fixed income, affordable housing, how hard it was out there. "Define a while," I said. He hesitated, then said the word that changed everything. "Permanently." The air shifted. He talked about how she shouldn't be alone, about how the house had 3 bedrooms, how the guest room wasn't really necessary. When I reminded him that was my home office, he waved it off. "You can work in the living room." The dismissal was so casual it hurt more than if he'd shouted. 3 years of accommodating his mother, of being corrected and sidelined, of watching him choose her comfort over mine, suddenly crystallized into something painfully clear. I told him I wasn't comfortable, that this needed discussion. He shut it down immediately. "There's nothing to discuss. She's moving in next weekend." When I pointed out he hadn't even asked me, his face hardened. "It's my mom. She's family. I didn't think I needed permission." When I reminded him this was our home, not just his, he straightened, voice cold. "If you can't accept my mother, maybe you should leave." The words landed heavier than he expected. I blinked, waiting for him to take them back. He didn't. He doubled down, told me she was family, that she'd been there before me and would be there after me. Something inside me settled. The anxiety, the anger, all of it clicked into clarity. Okay, I said. He looked genuinely surprised. Okay, what? Okay, I'll leave. He recovered quickly, told me I wasn't taking the house from him, that he'd built a life there. I didn't argue. I went to the bedroom, grabbed my laptop, and texted my best friend that I needed to talk. Urgently. By the time I finished explaining, she was already looping her dad into the call. And that was the moment everything he thought he owned started to unravel. The thing about clarity is that once it arrives, there's no going back to confusion. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't argue my way through the night trying to make him understand what partnership actually meant. I let him talk himself into believing he'd won something. He went to bed confident, already planning how his mother would rearrange the guest room, already picturing me adjusting the rest of my life around his decision. Meanwhile, I sat on the edge of the couch with my laptop open, listening to my best friend's dad explain, very calmly, exactly how the lease worked. He was furious, but not at me. He told me he'd offered that place to us because he trusted me, because he believed I would respect the property and the agreement. My fiancé was never meant to be more than an approved occupant, not a tenant, not a decision maker, certainly not someone who could bring in another permanent resident without notification or consent. When I told him my fiancé had given me an ultimatum about his house, my friend's dad went quiet for a second. Then he said, "He thinks it's his house." I told him yes. He said, "He's about to learn a very important lesson about reading documents." That same night, I emailed a formal request to terminate my lease early, citing irreconcilable changes in my living situation. Within an hour, he responded, accepting the termination effective in 30 days and waiving the early termination fee as a courtesy. Because here was the reality my fiancé never bothered to learn. When the only tenant leaves, the lease doesn't transfer, it ends. There was no safety net for him, no fallback, no right to stay. The next morning, my friend's dad personally delivered a notice to vacate. 30 days, standard procedure, clean, legal, final. I wasn't home when my phone started exploding. The first message came in all caps. "What the hell is this?" I didn't respond. The next message accused me of being dramatic, then cruel, then insane. 20 minutes later, he called. I let it ring out, then again and again. When I finally answered, he was shouting. "What did you do?" he demanded. "You got me evicted." "I terminated my lease," I said calmly. "Our lease," he snapped. "This is our lease." "No," I replied. "It's mine, my name only. Check your copy." There was silence on the line, long, heavy. "I never signed anything," he said, quieter now. "Exactly." He started pacing, talking over himself, insisting it wasn't possible, insisting we'd moved in together, insisting the house was his home. I let him finish before speaking again. "You moved in with me," I said. "I paid the landlord. You paid me. Your name isn't on the paperwork. It never was." "This is insane," he said. "You can't just kick me out." "I'm not kicking you out," I replied. "I'm leaving. You don't have a lease to stay under." The question that followed was almost pathetic. Where am I supposed to go? I didn't raise my voice. "Ask your mom," I said. "She seems great at housing solutions." I hung up before he could respond. That evening, he showed up at my friend's apartment, banging on the door like volume could undo paperwork. My friend's dad was there, helping me figure out logistics. He opened the door and stood between us. "You need to leave," he said. My fiancé tried to push past him. "This is between me and her." My friend's dad didn't budge. "Actually," he said, "this is literally my business. I own the property you're about to be trespassing from if you don't step back." That's when my fiancé finally looked scared. He tried apologizing, tried bargaining, tried rewriting the conversation from the night before. His mom didn't have to move in. He hadn't meant it. He was stressed. I listened without interrupting, then reminded him of his exact words, that his mother would be there after I was gone, that he'd told me to leave. I told him I was done. My friend's dad closed the door while my fiancé stood in the hallway realizing, too late, that authority he'd assumed was never his. That was the beginning of the entitlement spiral. His mother started calling immediately. When I didn't answer, she left voicemails dripping with rage and condescension. She called me vindictive, ungrateful, a witch. She said she'd always known I wasn't good enough for her son. I screenshot everything. Documentation mattered now. Over the next 2 weeks, they both tried every angle: guilt, anger, revisionist history. His sister called from an unknown number, asking how I could be so cold. I told her the truth. He'd given me an ultimatum and I'd accepted it. He hadn't expected consequences. That wasn't my problem. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I went back to the house to collect my things. That was when I discovered how far his mother was willing to go to punish me for leaving. I didn't go back to the house alone. I wasn't naive enough to think that was a good idea. I brought my friend's dad and 2 guys he trusted, people who understood that this wasn't about muscle, it was about witnesses. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach tightened. His car was there. So was his mother's. Boxes were stacked near the front door like she'd already claimed the place, like my presence in that house had been erased the moment I accepted his ultimatum. She was the first one to speak when I walked in. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she snapped, eyes sharp with triumph. I ignored her and said calmly that I was there to collect my belongings. I reminded everyone that I was still the legal tenant until the lease ended. My ex stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, jaw clenched, saying nothing. That silence told me everything I needed to know. He'd let her take the lead. Again. I moved room by room with a list I'd made beforehand. Clothes, books, personal documents, the desk and equipment from my home office, which his mother had already started filling with her things. I took artwork off the walls that I'd purchased myself. When he tried to stop me from taking the television, I pulled up the receipt on my phone, my credit card, my purchase. He said we were a couple and everything was shared. I reminded him we weren't married, and even if we had been, documentation mattered. His mother hovered nearby, muttering insults under her breath, calling me selfish, petty, a vulture stripping the place bare. I didn't respond. Every word out of her mouth only reinforced why I was leaving. Then I went into the bedroom. My jewelry box was open, empty. I felt the air leave my lungs. The pieces inside weren't expensive, but they were irreplaceable. My grandmother's earrings, my mother's necklace. I asked where they were. My ex avoided my eyes. His mother stepped into the doorway, arms crossed, satisfaction flickering across her face. She said maybe I should have thought about my precious things before I decided to make her son homeless. That was the moment anger finally broke through the calm. I looked at my friend's dad. He was already pulling out his phone. "I'd like to report a theft," he said. Suddenly, the tone in the room shifted. My ex started talking fast, insisting it was a misunderstanding. His mother claimed she'd taken the jewelry for safekeeping because she was worried I'd accuse her of stealing. The irony was almost impressive. I told her to bring it back immediately. She resisted until she realized the police were on their way. When she returned with a small bag, I checked every piece with shaking hands. Everything was there. The officers still arrived. I filed a report anyway. Documentation mattered. The rest of the move passed in tense silence. As we loaded the last box into the car, my ex made one final attempt to rewrite history. He said we could still fix this, that he'd get his mom an apartment, that we could find a new place together and start fresh. I looked at him and felt nothing but exhaustion. I reminded him that he told me to leave, that he chose his mother over our partnership. That was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. I got into the car and drove away without looking back. In the days that followed, word spread. Slowly at first, then all at once. People who'd initially judged me changed their tone when they heard his mother had stolen from me. Friends started using phrases like, "You dodged a bullet." His sister reached out again, this time apologetic, admitting she hadn't realized how bad things were. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt validated. There's a difference. And while I was rebuilding in peace, he and his mother were learning what it actually meant to live together permanently. A 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. No yard, no space, no buffer. Exactly what they'd demanded, just without my support cushioning the fall. I heard through mutual friends that she blamed him constantly for letting me leave, that he worked overtime just to keep up. She refused to move out. After everything she'd sacrificed for him, she wasn't going anywhere. The jewelry incident lingered like a shadow. Even without charges, it changed how people saw them. Theft has a way of clarifying character. Every time someone asked me if I regretted how I handled things, I thought about that open box, about how quickly entitlement turned into punishment when control slipped away. That was when I knew, without doubt, that leaving hadn't just been necessary. It had been overdue. 3 weeks after I drove away with the last of my boxes, the 30-day notice expired. The house that had once been his, in every story he told, was already occupied by new tenants, a young couple with a baby on the way. They hung wind chimes on the porch and planted flowers along the walkway. Life moved forward without asking permission from the people who thought it owed them something. I heard about it through mutual friends, the way you hear about storms passing in places you no longer live. Distant, informational, no emotional pull. My ex and his mother didn't land softly. They ended up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she immediately complained about. Too small, too loud, too far from her friends. No yard, no space for her things. From what filtered back to me, she blamed him almost immediately. If he'd handled me better, if he'd kept me happy, none of this would have happened. The irony was thick. She was living with him permanently now, exactly what he'd insisted on, just without the comfort and stability my presence had provided. He was working overtime to keep up with rent. Her Social Security barely covered her share. The comfortable life he'd assumed would always be there had evaporated the moment I stopped propping it up. His sister reached out again, this time without defensiveness. She apologized, told me she finally understood why I'd left. She admitted their mother was impossible to live with, that my ex was exhausted and quietly miserable. She said he'd been asking about me, wondering if there was any chance we could talk. I didn't respond. Some conversations don't lead anywhere worth going. I mailed the engagement ring back, certified mail. I didn't want a single excuse for future contact, no claim that I'd kept something that wasn't mine. He sent a brief text acknowledging receipt. No apology, no reflection, just confirmation. That silence told me more than words ever could. His mother, predictably, went on a campaign of her own. She told anyone who would listen that I was vindictive, unstable, the woman who destroyed her son's life. But the story never held up when people asked basic questions. Didn't he tell her to leave? Wasn't the lease in her name? Didn't you take her jewelry? Each follow-up poked holes she couldn't patch. Over time, the whispers shifted, not toward praise for me, but toward understanding, and that was enough. I stayed with my best friend while I looked for my own place. It was cramped and imperfect and peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. No criticism over how I loaded the dishwasher, no commentary on my schedule, no one treating my boundaries like inconveniences. In the quiet, I let myself grieve. 3 years is a long time. There were good memories, trips, holidays, evenings that once felt like safety. But good memories don't obligate you to accept bad treatment. They don't mean you owe someone your autonomy. When I signed the lease on my new apartment, the landlord asked if anyone else would be living there. Just me, I said. It felt grounding to say it out loud. I bought furniture slowly, intentionally, only what I needed. Nothing chosen to impress anyone else. Starting over at 28 wasn't the plan I'd had, but neither was spending my life as second priority to a man who mistook compliance for love. Some people told me I'd been petty, that I should have fought harder for the relationship, compromised more. They didn't see the 3 years of compromise that came before the ultimatum. They didn't understand that the house wasn't just a lease. It was the moment I realized how much power I'd been giving away to someone who never respected it. When he told me to leave, he genuinely believed he could take my home from me. The shock on his face when he learned he couldn't still stays with me. The last message I heard about him came through his sister. He was still trying to get their mother to move out. She refused. After everything she'd sacrificed, she wasn't going anywhere. He was trapped now, living the consequences of a choice he'd made casually, assuming I'd absorb the costs like I always had. I didn't feel victorious, I felt finished. There's a difference between revenge and reclaiming your life. I didn't take anything from him that wasn't already mine. I simply accepted his ultimatum exactly as he gave it. I left. I took my lease. I took my peace. And I built something new without asking permission. I'll take the fresh start.